In this video, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about scenario configuration. I've mentioned scenario configuration a couple of times in other videos, and you may already have a pretty good understanding about it, but just in case, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about it. Scenario configuration is something that is happening in Forge very frequently. In fact, it happens every single time any change is made to any data in your scenario. When that happens, the entire scenario is reconfigured. So every time you hit an accept button, every time you move a waypoint on a unit, the entire scenario is reconfigured. So we're going to talk about what happens during scenario configuration and why it is that it's necessary for it to take place every time a scenario is changed. So what we're going to do is, first of all, talk about the overall steps. So when scenario is configured, the first thing we do is we go to all the units in the scenario. So I'm going to go to the units window here. And we'll reset the map. So here we have just 2 units in the scenario, and these units have different models that are attached to them. And these models are unique copies of the models, unique modeling objects that are attached to these units that were created by cloning the meta objects, which we've talked about in another video. The first thing that we do in scenario configuration is we go to all the units in the scenario and we wipe them clean. We take all these objects that are attached to every single unit in the scenario and we destroy them. We take them, we throw them away. Then we go to all the meta objects in the scenario. So we've talked about those in a previous video, and I'll go to the Scenario Explorer. So we've got a bunch of different meta objects here. And the meta objects are the objects that get attached to units. So cognition models, equipment models, and attribute models, those are the models that get cloned and attached to units. We go to every one of the meta objects and we call configure for every one of them. Now, what takes place when a meta object is configured depends upon how the developer of that meta object implemented the configure method. The overall point is to allow the meta object to make sure that it still likes the data that is being entered. And because one meta object might depend on another meta object, we have to do that every time a change is made, because we don't know if a change was made that could have affected an object that a given meta object depends on. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So we go to all the meta objects and we configure all of them. A very important thing, if any meta object, a cognition model, an attribute model, or an equipment model fails to configure, that the developer who wrote the configure method, if that code in that configure method looks at the input values and the values are not acceptable for one reason or another, an error message will get generated, and we'll see where that comes out in a minute. And that model will be marked as having not been configured successfully. So again, we're talking about a meta object here. That's what we configure. If a meta object has not configured successfully, then when we later try to clone that meta object to attach it to a unit, that clone will not be allowed. So there's no reason to ever go configure these objects right here attached to the unit, because they would not exist on the unit unless they were cloned from a meta object that had configured successfully. So that's why we don't have to bother configuring these. We configure the meta objects, and if they pass, we can clone them. If they don't pass, they won't show up, and you'll see what happens when a meta object does not configure successfully. We also go to all of the other environment parameters. We allow them to all be configured. We basically go to, there's a whole bunch of other things in Flames that we go to. We configure everything. We go through the entire scenario, all the objects, the things that you see here, as well as all the internal services and objects that are inside of Flames. We reconfigure everything. And then one of the last things that we do in scenario configuration is we go back to the units and we reclone all the objects that are associated with them. And specifically what we're doing is we're going to the commands of every unit, and first we recompile the script. And this script, as you've already learned, is the actual input for the units. the Commands tab is giving us a graphical representation of the script and allows us to edit the script without having to ever actually go type anything in. But behind the scenes, as we're editing commands here, the script is being updated automatically. It's kind of like HTML, where this is the raw HTML, and then this would be the graphical view that you'd see of the HTML in a browser. This is the, and it's most convenient, of course, to edit the commands through this graphical user interface. There are some operations that you can only do through script, and that's in particular the composition of units, which we'll cover in a whole nother set of videos. But except for the composition, everything else can be specified through the command interface. So again, going back to configuring a unit, we go to the script and we compile this script. And there could be references to other objects in the script that have changed. And so while the script might have compiled one time, it might not compile this time, because you might be referring to a unit, for example, that doesn't exist in the scenario anymore. So you get a problem right away, and this script would not compile. And you get an error message for that. But assuming that it's all compiled successfully and there's no problems, we then go and execute all of the statements that are above the start statement. So these commands here, as well as in the script, this include statement, which you don't see from the command interface. There's no commands in that. That includes the script statements that compose the unit, that actually attach all of these models, clone those models and attach it to the unit. We'll talk about that in another video. So we execute this statement and all the statements that are in it, and we execute then this locate statement, which is this command right here, and then we stop. So that will clone all the meta objects on the unit, attach it to the unit, and then we execute this command, which is a cognition model command, which actually locates the unit. And then we stop, and we don't execute any of the rest of these commands until after scenario execution is started. So we'll do that for each unit in the scenario. So when we're finished, all the units have a brand new, fresh copy of all the meta objects. And again, these are meta objects that have configured successfully. So any change that we made to any meta object will be reflected in all of the units that clone and use that meta object in their composition. They'll get a brand new copy of it. So if we change the max speed on this truck, then when we hit accept, we'll get a new meta object with that value, and this unit will get a new copy of that meta object. So any change that we make to any meta object will be reflected in all the units that make use of that meta object. So scenario configuration is a really big deal. And this is the way that we give feedback to scenario editors, people who are editing a scenario, to make sure that they're entering data that is correct. What you don't want to have happen is you don't want to enter data and then run the scenario, and when it's all finished, you have to look through your logs and look through your results and find out that something didn't work right. And it's all because a particular input value was entered wrong. You don't want to finish the run and have to find that out later. You want to find that out before you start the run. And Forge has, that's probably one of the biggest things that Forge has in it. It's something that is very, very important. It's constantly checking your input values to make sure that you've entered things correctly. So what we're going to do now for the remainder of this video is we're going to go enter some incorrect data in different places and show you the value of scenario configuration and what happens when you enter incorrect data. So far I don't have any error messages in here, and so everything is configured successfully. I'll know if something doesn't configure, and you'll see that in a minute. By the way, anytime you want, if you can go to the scenario menu and say configure now, and it'll go through the whole configuration step and tell you configuration is complete. But that's usually not necessary because, again, scenario configuration is taking place all the time, every time you make any change. So let's go see how that happens. The thing we're going to do is we're going to go to a sensor model, and that's going to be able to allow me to illustrate some of the things that configure does. So I'm going to go to this shooter. And he's got this sensor model right here, this blue radar, the blue sensor. So I double click on this, it takes me to the sensor window. And you might remember I can get to this sensor window in different ways. If I have the Scenario Explorer window open, I can see all of my sensor meta objects, and I can just go click on it, and if that window's not already opened, it will open that. Or if that sensor window's not open, I can just go to the parameters menu, and the organization of the menus underneath this particular main menu is the same as the organization of the objects in the Scenario Explorer. So I can show you that if I go to the Scenario Explorer. You can see how things are organized here, and parameters are the same way. So you see underneath parameters right here, you see the same hierarchy of menus right here. So I can go to the parameters menu underneath equipment and select sensors, and that will open the sensors window. So there are multiple ways to get to that sensors window. And as we've talked about before, there's one window in Forge for editing the objects that belong to every primary class of object in Flames. So if I go back to my Scenario Explorer, or actually I can just look at my menu, there's a window for the Earth model, terrain data, all these different types of objects right here. There's a window for cognition models, there's a window for equipment models, there's a window for attributes, there's a window for dictionary patterns. They all have their own window. And most windows look exactly the same, as you already know, and as we'll talk about in more detail later in this series of videos. So here's a sensor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own data set in memory. So I click on that button, I get an untitled data set, and I'm going to save this blue sensor object, create a blue sensor object in my own data set. So I hit accept. I now get this message that tells me that I've created something in my data set. So I can click on this thing. I have two data sets loaded, and they both have an object named blue sensor, but because this data set is higher priority, I only see the one that's in this data set. Data set priorities and how that works is covered in more detail in another video. So I made my own copy of this. I'm not going to save this scenario. I'm not going to save this data set. I only want to have it here in memory to be able to make a change to it. If I was using an object that is owned by another, that's stored in a data set that I don't own and I don't have update permission, if I try to make a change, I'm going to get this message from Flames that says I don't have update permission for this object that is objects that are in this data set. So by making my own copy of this object in my own untitled data set, I can now make changes to it. So let's go and change some of the data here and show you how configuration is useful. So I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to take out the name of the data processor. So data processor is used by this particular sensor object, and this is common for the way that at least we model radars in Flames. You don't have to do it this way, but that's how a lot of our models that we provide for you model it. We have a data processor that does the tracking. So the sensor makes the detection, we pass that detection off to the data processor, and the data processor creates tracks. And we also use an antenna to model the gain pattern of the radar. So we can use the same detection algorithms, but different antennas. So by breaking it up this way, we can swap out the tracker that we're using and swap out the antenna that we're using, but still use all the same detection algorithms. This is, of course, an extremely simple sensor model. It's not really a radar model, and we keep it simple, as I've mentioned already, for the purposes of these tutorials. But we do use a data processor and an antenna just to show you a typical way that we can make one object be a composite of multiple objects. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to just make this blank, and then I'm going to hit accept. So right here, configuration is taking place, but it's not configuration for the whole scenario. It's a configuration just for this object. So what Flames did is it created a new instance of this class. It allowed that class to retrieve its input values from the screen, And then it invoked the configure method for that object to say, do you like the inputs that were just entered? So this particular configure method, again, this is written by the developer of this class, which of course is Turnitin, but you can get the source code to this and change it, or make your own sensor models and make any kind of model that has its own configure method. Just it says no data processor specified, and because it's required, it says there's no data processor specified data processor does not support the track data processor interface. So of course it doesn't, because there isn't a data processor. So it says entity configuration failed, so accept changes anyway. Normally we would say no, and we go back in here and we would fix this. So whenever a model requires the name of an object for its process, another object for its processing, we have to specify its name. The user interface can give us a way to select the name of that object very, very nicely, instead of having to go find it and type it in manually. Now you don't have to do it this way, but it's what all the models that we write at Turnitin that you can use as your examples, they all put these little buttons on the user interface that allow you to go select an object that can be used here. So we'll click on this button. This will go to the data processor manager, which has a list of all the data processors, and it will only show me the data processors that support the interface that is required by this particular object. And we'll talk about interfaces in a little bit more detail when we talk about how to compose units. So it gives me only those objects that support, so I can just double click on it. It puts the name in there and I hit accept and I'm good to go. We also have these buttons here usually that allow us to go to look at the input parameters, the meta object that's specified right here. So I can click on that. It opens up the data processor window and I can see the input parameters associated with that. When this particular sensor gets cloned, the sensor itself makes copies of the meta objects that are referenced right here. So 3 objects actually get attached to the unit: the sensor itself, and then the antenna object and the data processor object. This is a subsystem object. That they also get cloned by this sensor, and they get attached to the unit. So I go back to the units here, you'll see not only does he have his sensor, but he has his data processor, and he has a subsystem, which is that antenna. So that all happened during configuration when that sensor model was cloned for this unit. So I saw what happened when I specified something that was wrong. Let's go in here and change the name. So I'm picking now an object that doesn't even exist in my scenario, and I say accept. So it says that doesn't say that it doesn't exist. It just says that it's not even found at all. So what do I want to do here? And normally, again, I would fix it. But let's just say, for some reason, I say I want to accept a change. Or this is not a change that I made myself. This is an object that was already loaded, and it had in the data set, and it already had a bad value in it. So I say yes. So all kinds of problems take place when that happens. So if I say yes, Flames goes ahead and uses that particular meta object. So just as when the object, and I didn't mention that, if it's successful, so let me go back and do that again and hit accept. So it created a new instance of that object. It retrieved the values off the screen. It called configure. Configure succeeded, so there were no error, no window got popped up here. It takes that new object and it replaces it. It uses it to replace the object that was in here already. So this is actually a brand new instance of this object with my values. So that's what happens when configuration is successful. If configuration fails and I say go ahead and accept it anyway, we take that new object that we just created, that we just configured, and it failed, but because we said accept it anyway, we took that object even though it didn't configure successfully, and we used it to replace the existing object. So now this object is this object that has the values in it that are incorrect. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, we reconfigure the entire scenario whenever any change is made to anything in the scenario. So we went back and reconfigured, and it tells me the same message, gives me the same message that I got when I tried to configure this guy. When I said configure here, it said specified data processor not found. So it says error configuring blue sensor, specified data processor that name not found. So it's the same error message that I got before, but I see it over here because I reconfigured everything in the scenario. So this sensor got configured again as a process of configuring all the objects in the scenario. So here it is right here, and it tells me I have this error. Now, one of the nice things about the status window is, and by the way, anytime you have any kind of error message in the status window, or any kind of warning message, which will be done in purple, you need to make sure you fix it. Don't keep going, fix it right away, try to find out what's wrong and fix it, because your scenario is not going to run right if configuration does not succeed. And if it succeeds, you won't get any message at all. It just tells you that it was updated and there's no problem. So you don't keep getting all these messages that say succeed, succeed, succeed. You won't get a message unless it fails. So one of the things you can do, you can put your cursor, click anywhere on the line where it says error configuring sensor or any type of object in the scenario. And you can click on that and click this little button right here. I'm going to close this window just to show you how this works. You can't really see that I've clicked there, but I click on it and I hit this button, and it will open the window to the object that is failing to configure. So it just jumps right to it. So you can see it says specified data processor not found, so you can go look and see, oh, there's the problem. So before I fix it, I'm going to show you what happens when that particular error occurs. I now get an error configuring the blue shooter. And the error says employee statement error could not attach blue sensor to the unit. So employee is a specific script statement that we use to attach a meta object to a unit. So that statement failed. And why did it fail? Well, that blue sensor exists in the scenario, but as I mentioned earlier, it didn't configure successfully, so Flames will not allow it to be attached to a unit. So if I go over to my unit and I look at its configuration, so I'll click again now and look at that to update it, you'll see that I don't have a sensor on there or a data processor or a subsystem for that antenna. So this unit doesn't have those models, so it's really an incomplete unit because it couldn't configure, it couldn't employ this sensor model that was not configured successfully. Sometimes there are other models on a unit that depend on there being other models attached to a unit, and sometimes you'll get even more errors. And of course, if you have multiple units in the scenario that are using this particular sensor model, you will get multiple errors. In fact, let me just illustrate this. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to make a copy of this blue shooter. So I'm going to create a new data set and I'm going to accept that. And I'm going to get the same error in configuring this unit because the sensor didn't exist. But I'm going to say accept changes anyway. And then I'm going to actually create a new copy of it. I'm going to call it blue shooter 2 and accept it. And it also doesn't configure. But now you'll notice that I've got, when I went back and configured the entire scenario, the blue sensor didn't configure, and now I've got 2 units that are not configuring because 2 units are trying to employ this sensor meta object that didn't configure successfully. So in a typical scenario where you've got hundreds or thousands of units that might be, and you may have several hundred that are using a given object, if you make a change or if there's something wrong with that object, you'll get perhaps hundreds of units here that are saying they don't configure. Well, the solution is always to go to the very first error message and figure out and solve that one first, because by solving that one, you might end up fixing all the other ones. So I'm going to click on this and go to this guy. I'm going to put a good data processor on. I'm going to hit accept. So now that updates and I don't get any error messages anymore. So that's one of the places where we do configuration, and you can see what happens when you have an object that doesn't configure. So let's show you another case where we may have a problem that is not caused by the particular editing the particular inputs of a given object. This sensor, as we've pointed out, is trying to clone this particular data processor. Let me go over to this window right here and we can see this data processor. I'm going to drop this data set. When I drop this data set from my scenario, guess what happens? Now, so I'll go down here and I see the message for dropping the data set, which is down here. I scrolled up too far. So here's the message where I dropped the data set. This window's giving me constant feedback on all the things, all the changes that I make. And now I'm getting the same configuration error. Blue sensor, it says blue sensor tracker not found. And it's not because I changed anything about this sensor. It's because I changed something else in this scenario that this sensor meta object depends on. I went and loaded I dropped my data processor data set. So that's one of the reasons why we have to reconfigure the entire scenario anytime any change is made, because we don't know if the change that we just made is somehow going to disrupt a dependency of another object in the scenario. So we get that same problem with the sensor because that data processor doesn't exist. And then sure enough, we get our two units that are trying to attach that unit, trying to employ that sensor. They are barking at us, telling us that they can't configure correctly. So we go to the first problem. We say blue sensor. We go look at the sensor. So we click there. We go to that sensor. It says blue data processor. What's going on? I go try to look at it. And it says, what's going on? It doesn't exist in the scenario. And I try to browse, and there are no data processors. Aha! I don't have the right data processor data set loaded. So I go back over here. This data processor data set is owned by the example database user. So I load that. I now get this message that says I loaded it, and now configuration doesn't give me any errors at all. So everything's happy again. We're fine. So there's examples of what happens when configuration fails. There's a lot of different cases where configuration can fail because there's lots and lots of checks that take place when a scenario is configured. But this is overall what happens. Again, we configure only the meta objects, and then we try to attach them to a unit. And when the unit gets configured, is when we try to actually go attach it. So if I click on these guys, you can see now my objects are there. So that's the scenario configuration step. It's a very, very important step. It's one of the reasons why Flames is so easy to use, so friendly, because it's constantly giving you feedback as to whether or not the values that you've entered are acceptable to the developers who wrote the models that you're using. It's a pretty long topic, but hopefully it sunk in. It's important to understand this. So if you get errors in your scenario, you'll understand why. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for using Flames.